Hannah Brewer locks eyes with her husband's grieving mother across the packed courtroom and slowly, deliberately curls her lips into a cold, triumphant smile, a chilling display of absolute certainty in her own invincibility. She had woven a web of lies so masterful, so airtight, that she believed she was untouchable, convinced that the only person who could destroy her alibi lay silenced forever beneath 6 feet of earth. But the voice that was about to shatter her perfect facade would come from beyond what she thought was the grave, a voice she was certain she had watched take its final gasping breath on the blood-stained kitchen floor. The community of Northwood Hills knew Hannah Brewer as a pillar of grace and dedication, a second-grade teacher whose classroom was a haven of creativity and warmth. She organized the yearly charity bake sale, volunteered at the local animal shelter, and her garden was the envy of the entire neighborhood. Her life with her husband Matthew, a kind-hearted architect, and their 7-year-old son Leo was seen by all as the picture of suburban perfection, a real-life fairy tale built on shared dreams and mutual respect. Their home, a lovingly restored colonial with a sprawling oak tree in the front yard, was a frequent gathering spot for friends and family, always filled with the sounds of laughter and the aroma of Hannah's famous apple pie. To the outside world, their bond was unbreakable, a testament to 14 years of what appeared to be unwavering love and partnership. This public perception made the events of their 15th wedding anniversary all the more incomprehensible, transforming a day of celebration into a night of unspeakable horror. Matthew had planned a surprise dinner, filling the house with candles and the soft melody of their wedding song, presenting Hannah with a delicate locket engraved with their initials. But beneath Hannah's appreciative smiles and tender kisses, a chilling resolve was hardening, a plan cultivated in the secret, dark corners of a life no one knew she was leading. As their son slept soundly upstairs, and with the last of the champagne poured, Hannah's meticulously crafted facade finally crumbled, not in a fit of rage, but with the cold, quiet precision of a predator who had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She had decided that this anniversary would not mark another year of marriage, but the brutal, bloody end of it. The betrayal was absolute, a shocking act of violence that defied all reason and comprehension for those who thought they knew this woman. While Matthew's back was turned, his heart full from an evening celebrating their life together, Hannah acted with a savagery that was utterly alien to the gentle schoolteacher persona she had so masterfully perfected over the years. The attack was swift and brutal, a devastating ambush in the very sanctuary where they had built their family and shared their most intimate moments. She left him on the polished hardwood floor of their dining room, surrounded by the remnants of their anniversary celebration, convinced that her final violent act had permanently erased the man who stood in the way of her desired new beginning. In the aftermath, as Matthew lay silent and still, Hannah moved with an unnerving calm, her mind already shifting from the gruesome reality of her actions to the next phase of her elaborate deception. She meticulously altered the scene, staging a robbery gone wrong with a composure that spoke of a profound and terrifying disconnect from the humanity of her husband and the sanctity of their life together. Her goal was not just to kill a man, but to murder a life, to annihilate the past so she could step into a future she had secretly been building with another person, a future funded by the life insurance policy she had checked on just 3 days prior. The love story of Hannah and Matthew Brewer was not just over, it was a lie, and its final chapter was written in blood by the one person he had trusted above all others. The call to 911 came just after 11 at night, the voice on the other end, frantic, breathless, and convincingly hysterical. Hannah Brewer, the loving wife, screamed to the dispatcher about a break-in, about a masked intruder, and about finding her husband unconscious in a pool of his own blood. She played the part of the distraught victim flawlessly, her panicked cries echoing the genuine terror of any person who had just lived through such an ordeal. The first responders who arrived at the scene found a woman in shock, wrapped in a blanket on her neighbor's porch, while paramedics desperately worked on her husband. They saw a community rallying around one of their own, a beloved teacher whose perfect world had just been shattered by a random act of violence, and not a single person suspected the monster was the one who had made the call. Investigators initially treated the case as a straightforward home invasion, a tragic but not uncommon event in a world where violence can intrude upon even the safest of havens. They canvassed the neighborhood, collected preliminary evidence, and took Hannah's statement, documenting her tearful, disjointed account of the evening's horrific events. She spoke of a shadowy figure, a deep voice, and the paralyzing fear that had gripped her as she hid in a closet, listening to the sounds of a struggle. Her performance was masterful, every detail designed to elicit sympathy and steer suspicion far away from herself. The detectives, seasoned and cynical, felt a pang of pity for the young widow, a woman whose life had been irrevocably broken by an act of senseless brutality. But as the initial shock wore off and the forensic teams began their meticulous work, tiny inconsistencies started to emerge, small threads that, when pulled, threatened to unravel Hannah's entire fabricated narrative. The supposed point of entry showed no signs of forced entry, and the house, while disturbed, did not look like it had been ransacked for valuables by a panicked burglar. The family dog, known for its loud and protective nature, had not made a sound throughout the entire alleged ordeal, a detail that struck the lead detective as particularly odd. These were minor points, easily explained away on their own, but together they formed a quiet chorus of doubt in the back of the investigators' minds, a dissonance that clashed with the perfect story of a grieving widow. The true nature of Hannah Brewer, the loving wife and dedicated teacher, remained hidden behind a mask of sorrow, a carefully constructed illusion she had spent years perfecting. Friends and family surrounded her, bringing casseroles and offering tearful condolences, all of them completely unaware of the chilling truth that lay beneath the surface. They mourned the loss of Matthew alongside her, sharing memories of his kindness and generosity, while Hannah absorbed their sympathy like a sponge, using their grief to fortify her own lies. She was the central figure in a tragedy of her own making, the author and star of a horrific play, and for now her audience was completely captivated by her award-winning performance. In the interrogation room, under the flat, humming glow of fluorescent lights, Hannah Brewer's performance continued, but the audience had changed. Detectives Miles Corbin and Jessica Reyes were not grieving neighbors, they were seasoned investigators with a combined 30 years of experience in reading the subtle language of deceit. They began the interview gently, offering condolences and allowing Hannah to recount her story for the third time, watching her every move, listening to every carefully chosen word. She spoke of her love for Matthew, of their plans for the future, and of the monstrous phantom who had stolen it all away from them, her voice cracking at all the right moments. She was building a fortress of lies, brick by painful brick, convinced of its impenetrable strength. But the detectives had come armed with more than just questions. They had the first round of forensic reports and a timeline that was becoming increasingly problematic for Hannah's version of events. Detective Corbin, in his calm, methodical voice, began to point out the inconsistencies, not as accusations, but as points of confusion he hoped she could clarify. He asked about the unforced window, the silent dog, and the curious lack of any foreign DNA at the scene, presenting each piece of contradictory evidence as a simple puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. With each question, a flicker of irritation would cross Hannah's face, a momentary crack in her sorrowful facade, before it was quickly plastered over with another wave of manufactured grief and confusion. The true measure of her contempt for their intelligence came when she started to elaborate on her lies, adding new, superfluous details in an attempt to make her story seem more real. She invented a second intruder, described a getaway car she couldn't possibly have seen from her hiding place, and even suggested a motive connected to Matthew's work that she knew to be completely false. It was a classic strategy of a pathological liar, over-explaining and over-embellishing, driven by a narcissistic belief that she was smarter than anyone in the room and could weave a reality more convincing than the truth. She wasn't just lying to protect herself, she was performing an act of intellectual condescension, treating the detectives as a captive audience for her sordid fiction. The turning point in the interrogation came not with a shouted accusation, but with a quiet, simple presentation of a single photograph. Detective Reyes slid a picture across the table showing Matthew in his hospital bed, alive but in a deep coma, his survival a closely guarded secret. For the first time, Hannah's composure shattered completely, her carefully constructed world collapsing in an instant as she stared at the image of the man she was certain she had killed. The mask of the grieving widow fell away, replaced by a flash of pure, unadulterated rage, a fury directed not at an intruder, but at the man who had failed to die as he was supposed to, her face twisting into a sneer of disbelief and frustration. Her confession, when it finally came, was not a flood of remorseful tears, but a torrent of indignant self-pity and venomous blame. She didn't confess to murder, but to being a victim of a passionless marriage, a martyr who had been driven to her actions by Matthew's supposed neglect and lack of ambition. She painted herself as the protagonist in a tragic romance, a woman who had found a new, more deserving love and had been forced to take drastic measures to escape her suffocating life. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the horror she had inflicted, only a chilling and profound belief in her own righteousness, a sociopathic justification for an act of pure selfish evil. The arrest itself was a quiet affair, a stark contrast to the violent chaos of the crime scene and the emotional theatrics of the interrogation room. As she was led out of the precinct in handcuffs, Hannah Brewer looked not like a monster, but like the woman everyone thought they knew, a confused, frightened teacher caught in a terrible nightmare. She had already begun to recalibrate her narrative, shifting from the grieving widow to the wrongfully accused wife, a new role she would embrace with the same theatrical commitment. She was confident, even as the cold steel clicked around her wrists, that this was just a temporary setback, a misunderstanding she could easily charm her way out of once she was in front of a sympathetic jury. The path to that jury, however, would be paved with the very evidence she believed did not exist. The detectives had her confession, but it was a confession riddled with self-serving lies and a complete lack of accountability. They knew that her conviction would not be secured by her words, but by the slow, methodical deconstruction of the perfect life she had presented to the world. They would need to dig into her finances, her communications, her secret life, and expose the rot that had been festering beneath the surface of the idyllic Brewer family home for years. The investigation was far from over. It was just beginning. Hannah, sitting in the back of the squad car, stared out at the passing streetlights, a small, defiant smile playing on her lips. She felt a sense of relief, a strange and twisted liberation from the life she had so desperately wanted to escape. She was no longer just a wife and a mother, she was the center of a dramatic high-stakes story, a captivating figure of tragedy and intrigue. In her mind, the trial would be her stage, the ultimate platform to tell her version of the story and win the public's adoration and sympathy. She was utterly blind to the reality of her situation, insulated from the consequences of her actions by a wall of narcissism so thick it was impenetrable. The public story of Hannah Brewer, the wrongfully accused teacher and grieving wife, began to take shape within hours of her arrest. Her stunned colleagues and friends rallied to her defense, describing her as a gentle soul incapable of violence, a woman devoted to her family and her students. They painted a picture of a perfect marriage, citing the frequent public displays of affection and the loving family photos that filled her social media pages. This narrative, fueled by genuine shock and a deep-seated belief in the woman they thought they knew, created a formidable wall of public sympathy that prosecutors knew they would have to dismantle piece by methodical piece. Behind the scenes, however, a very different picture of Hannah was beginning to emerge, one brushstroke at a time, from the digital and financial records she left behind. Investigators, armed with search warrants, dove into the couple's bank accounts, credit card statements, and loan applications, and what they found was not a partnership, but a parasitic relationship. For years, Hannah had been systematically draining their joint finances, opening secret credit cards in Matthew's name and forging his signature on documents to secure personal loans she had no intention of repaying. The money, amounting to over $100,000, had vanished without a trace, spent on luxury items, lavish trips, and expensive gifts that Matthew had never seen. The investigation uncovered the motive behind the financial drain, a secret second life. Detectives found a hidden email account and a burner phone Hannah had used to communicate with her lover, a man she had been seeing for over 2 years. The messages revealed the depth of her deception, filled with passionate declarations of love and detailed plans for their future together, a future that was entirely contingent on her being free from Matthew. She had promised her lover a life of wealth and adventure, spinning a web of lies about a large inheritance she was due to receive, a convenient fiction to explain the sudden influx of cash she anticipated from Matthew's life insurance policy. She wasn't just cheating on her husband, she was orchestrating a complete replacement of her current life with a new one built on a foundation of theft and deceit. This revelation painted the crime in a new, even more sinister light. It was not a spontaneous act of passion, but the calculated final step in a long-term business plan where her husband was the only obstacle to be liquidated. The financial pressure had been mounting, with collection agencies beginning to call and the secret loans on the verge of default. Hannah had been running out of time, and Matthew's anniversary surprise had unwittingly provided the perfect opportunity to execute her brutal exit strategy. The attack was an act of financial preservation, a cold-blooded transaction designed to solve her debt problem and fund her escape into a fantasy life, with her husband's death being the cost of doing business. The evidence transformed the prosecution's understanding of the case, shifting the focus from a domestic dispute to a cold, premeditated crime driven by pure, unadulterated greed. They now had a clear and compelling motive that shattered the defense's narrative of a loving but troubled marriage. Hannah Brewer was not a victim. She was a predator who had viewed her kind, trusting husband as nothing more than a financial instrument, a resource to be exploited and then discarded when he was no longer useful. The image of the dedicated teacher and loving wife was a carefully maintained cover for a ruthless con artist and a cold-blooded killer. The weight of this new evidence was immense, a silent testament to the vast chasm between Hannah's public persona and her private reality. Investigators found receipts for expensive hotel stays booked while she was supposed to be at teaching conferences and records of jewelry purchases for her lover made with money taken from their son's college fund. Each discovery was another layer of betrayal, another piece of proof that the woman Matthew Brewer had loved and trusted was a complete fabrication, a hollow shell of a person devoid of empathy or conscience. Her entire life was a performance, and the curtain was finally being pulled back to reveal the darkness backstage. As Hannah sat in her jail cell, consulting with her defense attorney, she remained blissfully unaware of the digital and paper trail that was inexorably closing in on her. She continued to maintain her innocence, crafting a new narrative in which she was the victim of a vindictive and incompetent police investigation. She was preparing for a battle of charisma and emotion in the courtroom, confident that her tears and heartfelt testimony would sway any jury. She had no idea that the prosecution was preparing for a different kind of trial, one that would be fought not with words and emotions, but with the cold, hard, and undeniable language of numbers, dates, and receipts. The financial records told a story far more compelling than any tale Hannah could invent, a silent, damning narrative of greed, betrayal, and a chilling disregard for human life. The detectives had uncovered the why, the cold, calculating reason behind the savage attack on Matthew Brewer. Now, the prosecution's task was to present this story to a jury, to peel away the layers of deception and expose the heartless financial parasite who had been masquerading as a beloved member of their community for more than a decade. The stage was being set for a confrontation with the truth, and it was a truth from which Hannah would have no escape. In the months leading up to the trial, Hannah Brewer leaned heavily into her role as the misunderstood victim, a tragic figure caught in the crosshairs of a justice system desperate for a conviction. She gave carefully orchestrated interviews from jail to sympathetic local reporters, her voice trembling as she spoke of her undying love for her husband and her faith that the truth would eventually set her free. Her performance was meticulously rehearsed, a symphony of feigned vulnerability and quiet dignity designed to manipulate public opinion and poison the potential jury pool. She understood the power of perception and was determined to win the war for hearts and minds before the trial even began. The pre-trial hearings offered the first glimpse of the real Hannah, the one who existed behind the mask of sorrow. In the sterile environment of the courtroom, away from the sympathetic gaze of television cameras, her demeanor shifted. She would often be seen smiling and chatting casually with her defense attorney, Stephen Carlson, only to have her face crumble into a mask of theatrical despair the moment she knew the courtroom sketch artist was looking her way. This constant jarring shift between casual indifference and overwrought anguish was deeply unsettling to the few observers present, a clear sign of a performance rather than genuine emotion. Her attempts to feign remorse were so unconvincing that they became insulting, a mockery of the very real suffering of Matthew's family. During one hearing, as the prosecutor detailed the severity of Matthew's injuries, Hannah produced a tissue and dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes, her shoulders shaking with manufactured sobs that produced no tears. It was a sickening display, a hollow pantomime of grief that was so transparently false, it served only to highlight her profound emotional disconnect. She wasn't mourning her husband, she was playing the part of a mourner, and she was a terrible actress when the stakes were real. The most telling moment came when the judge denied her request for bail, citing her as a significant flight risk given the discovery of her secret life and financial dealings. As the decision was read, Hannah's carefully constructed composure momentarily broke, not into sadness, but into a flash of petulant anger, her lips curling into a silent snarl. She shot a look of pure venom at the prosecutor, Victoria Ramos, a look that conveyed not the fear of an innocent person, but the indignation of a guilty one who had been momentarily thwarted. It was a brief but powerful glimpse of the arrogant, entitled individual who believed she was above the consequences of her actions. Behind the scenes, her behavior was even more chilling. She spent her time in jail not reflecting on her actions, but meticulously planning her courtroom wardrobe, insisting on outfits that would make her appear soft, maternal, and non-threatening. She wrote letters to her supporters, filling the pages with self-pitying prose and veiled accusations against the police and Matthew's family, painting herself as a martyr in a grand conspiracy. Her focus was entirely on aesthetics and narrative control, a clear indication that she viewed the upcoming trial not as a reckoning with justice, but as the most important performance of her life. Her defense attorney, Stephen Carlson, a seasoned public defender, found himself in an increasingly difficult position. He was tasked with defending a client who seemed incapable of genuine emotion and whose primary concern was her public image rather than the mountain of evidence against her. He advised her to remain silent, to project an aura of solemnity, but Hannah, convinced of her own superior intelligence and persuasive charm, ignored his counsel. She believed she could outsmart everyone, that she could cry and pout her way to an acquittal, a delusion her lawyer knew would likely crumble under the harsh lights of cross-examination. The disconnect between Hannah's public performance and her private reality was a chasm that grew wider with each passing day. The public saw a heartbroken wife. While the prosecution saw a financial predator, her friends saw a gentle teacher, while investigators saw a would-be killer who had meticulously planned her husband's demise. This duality was at the heart of the case, the conflict between the convincing, likable mask and the monstrous face that lay beneath it. The prosecution's entire strategy rested on their ability to rip that mask away in front of a jury of her peers. As the trial date approached, Hannah's confidence grew, buoyed by the supportive letters and the fawning local news coverage she had so skillfully cultivated. She saw the prosecutors as overzealous bureaucrats and the police as bumbling fools she had easily tricked. She was completely insulated by her own narcissism, incapable of seeing the ironclad cage of evidence that was slowly being constructed around her. Her sickening performance of remorse was not just a legal strategy, it was a reflection of her core belief that she could manipulate reality itself, a belief that was about to be put to the ultimate test. The first day of the trial of the State versus Hannah Brewer began with a palpable tension that filled every corner of the packed courtroom. On one side sat the prosecution, led by the sharp and composed Victoria Ramos, her team organized and ready, with binders of evidence stacked neatly before them. On the other side sat Hannah, dressed in a soft, pale blue sweater, her hair pulled back demurely, looking less like a defendant accused of attempted murder and more like a PTA mom who had taken a wrong turn. Her expression was one of solemn fear, a carefully chosen mask for the occasion, and she occasionally glanced towards the gallery where Matthew's family sat, her eyes conveying a silent, rehearsed plea for understanding. After the jury was seated, Victoria Ramos approached the podium to deliver her opening statement, her presence commanding the room's absolute attention. She began not with an accusation or a timeline of the crime, but with a simple, powerful gesture to make the victim, Matthew Brewer, a real and tangible presence in the room. The large screens positioned for the jury flickered to life, not with gruesome crime scene photos, but with a short, vibrant video clip taken on Matthew's phone the day before the attack. In it, he was laughing, his face full of life and joy as he filmed his son Leo flying a kite in their sun-drenched backyard, a perfect slice of a life that was about to be violently shattered. The video showed a man deeply in love with his family, his voice warm and affectionate as he called out to Hannah, who could be seen for a moment in the background, smiling. He turned the camera on himself, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he spoke directly to his future self, talking about his excitement for their upcoming anniversary and the wonderful life he shared with his wife. 15 years, and I've never been happier, he said, his voice full of a genuine, uncomplicated joy that was now almost unbearable to watch. The clip ended, plunging the courtroom into a heavy, profound silence, the image of the smiling, living Matthew hanging in the air, a ghost in his own trial. Ramos allowed the silence to linger for a moment before she spoke, her voice clear and steady, devoid of theatrics. She described the man they had just seen on the screen, a loving husband and devoted father, a man whose trust had been used as a weapon against him. Then she methodically and chillingly detailed the crime, contrasting the beautiful life depicted in the video with the brutal, cold-blooded violence that had taken place in the same home just 24 hours later. She told the jury that the evidence would show this was not a home invasion, but an execution planned by the one person he trusted completely, the woman smiling in the background of his last happy video. Throughout the opening statement, Hannah sat at the defense table, weeping silently into a tissue. It was another one of her unconvincing performances, but this time its effect was diminished by the raw, authentic emotion of the video the jury had just witnessed. Her calculated sorrow seemed hollow and artificial when juxtaposed with the genuine happiness of the man she had tried to erase. Some jurors glanced at her, their expressions unreadable, while others kept their eyes fixed on Ramos, their faces hardened by the stark reality of the betrayal she described. When it was the defense's turn, Stephen Carlson rose and painted a picture of a flawed but loving marriage, acknowledging that the Brewers had their secrets and their problems, just like any other couple. He argued that the police, under pressure to solve a high-profile case, had zeroed in on his client, a grieving, traumatized woman, and had twisted the evidence to fit their preconceived narrative. He insisted that Hannah was just as much a victim as Matthew, her life destroyed first by an unknown assailant and now by a relentless and misguided prosecution. He concluded by telling the jury that by the end of the trial, they would see that the monster was still out there and that they were trying to convict the wrong person. The contrast between the two opening statements could not have been more stark. The prosecution had presented a narrative of cold, calculated betrayal, grounded in the emotional reality of the victim's own words. The defense had offered a story of mystery and police incompetence, a classic attempt to create reasonable doubt by muddying the waters and attacking the investigation. The jury was left to contemplate these two opposing realities, to decide which story the evidence would ultimately support. As the court adjourned for the day, the image of Matthew Brewer's smiling face remained etched in the minds of everyone who had been in the room. Victoria Ramos had successfully shifted the focus from the defendant's performance of grief to the victim's stolen life, making his absence a powerful, palpable force. Hannah Brewer had wanted to be the star of her own trial, but on the very first day, she had been upstaged by the ghost of the man she had failed to kill. The battle for justice had begun, and its first blow had been struck with the heartbreaking, undeniable truth of a home video. The prosecution's case against Hannah Brewer unfolded with methodical, devastating precision, each piece of evidence building upon the last to construct an irrefutable fortress of guilt. They began with the first responders and detectives, who testified about the pristine crime scene, the lack of forced entry, and the defendant's strangely calm demeanor in the hours after the attack. Next came the financial experts, who walked the jury through the mountain of debt, the secret credit cards, and the forged loan documents, laying bare the clear, desperate motive of greed that underpinned the entire brutal affair. The jury saw a woman not in the throes of passion, but in the grip of a financial crisis of her own making, who saw her husband's life as the only available bailout. The emotional core of the prosecution's case came from the testimony of Matthew's family and friends, who tearfully recounted his deep love for Hannah and his complete obliviousness to her betrayal. His mother, Eleanor Foster, spoke of how Matthew had called her the day of the anniversary, gushing with excitement about the surprise he had planned, his voice full of love for the woman who was, at that very moment, preparing to end his life. These stories humanized Matthew, transforming him from a name on a legal document into a living, breathing person whose stolen future was the central tragedy of the trial. With each witness, the image of Hannah as a loving wife crumbled a little more, replaced by the portrait of a cold and duplicitous predator. The mid-trial twist, however, came from a place Hannah had believed was her safest, most private sanctuary: her own computer. The prosecution called a digital forensics expert to the stand, a man who had meticulously excavated the digital ghost of Hannah's thoughts from the hard drive of her laptop. The expert testified that in the weeks leading up to the attack, the defendant's internet search history told a story of chilling premeditation. The courtroom fell silent as he read the searches aloud, displaying them on the large screens for the jury to see, each one a window into her dark and murderous intent. The list was damning and utterly bone-chilling. Life insurance payout rules for spouse, read one search query from 6 weeks before the attack. Easiest way to fake a home invasion, read another from a month prior. As the date of the attack grew closer, the searches became more specific and more gruesome. How to incapacitate a person quickly and quietly, best place to strike for maximum damage, and most horrifyingly, how long does it take to die from blunt force trauma? The jury stared at the screen, their faces a mixture of shock and disgust as they read the cold, methodical research of a killer planning her crime. The final search presented by the expert was from the morning of their 15th anniversary, just hours before Matthew would come home to his surprise dinner and his wife's brutal ambush. The search query was simple, clinical, and utterly monstrous: how to clean blood out of wood flooring. A collective gasp went through the courtroom gallery. This single search, more than any financial document or witness testimony, destroyed any lingering possibility that the attack was a spontaneous act or the work of a phantom intruder. It was the digital blueprint of a murder, the dispassionate to-do list of a woman who was more concerned with housekeeping after the fact than with the life she was about to take. Hannah's reaction was a study in failed composure. As the searches were read, her face paled, the blood draining from it, and her hands resting on the defense table began to tremble uncontrollably. Her mask of quiet sorrow shattered, replaced by the raw, panicked expression of a creature caught in a trap. She shot a desperate, furious look at her lawyer, as if he could somehow make the words on the screen disappear, but the evidence was undeniable, a digital echo of her own thoughts that she could not escape. Her carefully constructed persona had been annihilated by her own curiosity. The impact on the jury was immediate and profound. They had seen the happy, smiling Matthew in the home video, and now they had seen the cold, calculating research of the woman who had betrayed him. The juxtaposition was sickening, a clear and undeniable narrative of a predator and her prey. Any sympathy they might have had for the tearful teacher at the defense table evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. They were not looking at a victim. They were looking at a monster who had used Google to plan the destruction of her own family. When court adjourned for the day, the atmosphere was heavy with the weight of the digital evidence. The prosecution had not just presented a motive, they had presented a confession, a step-by-step guide to the crime written by the defendant herself. The question was no longer whether Hannah Brewer had attacked her husband, but how anyone could have ever believed she was innocent in the first place. The killer's search history had become the prosecution's most powerful witness, a silent, irrefutable voice from the machine that spoke only the truth. Facing a case that was rapidly collapsing under the weight of the prosecution's digital evidence, defense attorney Stephen Carlson knew he had to take a significant risk. His strategy shifted from creating reasonable doubt about the intruder to attacking the timeline and presenting an alternative narrative where Hannah, while deceitful in her finances, was not a violent attacker. The cornerstone of this new strategy was a surprise witness, a close friend of Hannah's named Sarah Miller, who was prepared to testify that she had been on the phone with Hannah during the exact time the prosecution claimed the attack had occurred, providing a crucial alibi. Sarah Miller took the stand, a nervous but resolute woman who clearly believed in her friend's innocence. She testified that she and Hannah spoke on the phone almost every night, and that on the night of the anniversary they had a long conversation that started around 10 o'clock and lasted for nearly 45 minutes. She recounted details of their conversation, talking about school, their children, and plans for the upcoming summer break. Carlson led her through the testimony skillfully, establishing a clear, uninterrupted block of time where Hannah could not possibly have been attacking her husband. For the first time since the trial began, a sliver of doubt seemed to enter the courtroom. During his cross-examination, Prosecutor Victoria Ramos was calm and methodical, asking Sarah to confirm the details of the call, the time it started, and the topics they discussed. Sarah's story remained consistent, and she appeared to be a credible, compelling witness for the defense. Hannah, for her part, watched the exchange with a renewed sense of confidence, a small, hopeful smile touching her lips. It seemed her lawyer had finally found a crack in the prosecution's seemingly airtight case. The alibi was strong, and it came from a witness with no apparent reason to lie. Then, in a moment of pure courtroom drama, the defense's narrative imploded spectacularly. As Sarah Miller confidently reiterated that her call with Hannah had ended at approximately 10:45, Victoria Ramos paused, looked down at her phone, and then back up at the witness. "Ma'am, are you absolutely certain about that timeline?" Ramos asked, her voice steady. Sarah confirmed that she was. At that moment, a bailiff approached the prosecution's table and handed Ramos a small folded note. She read it, her expression unreadable, and then looked at the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority, "the prosecution has just received new evidence directly pertaining to this witness's testimony." A murmur went through the courtroom as the judge allowed Ramos to proceed. She turned back to Sarah Miller, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "Miss Miller, you testified that you were on the phone with the defendant until 10:45 p.m. Is that correct?" Sarah nodded. Ramos then revealed the source of the new evidence, a text message sent just minutes ago to the lead detective on the case from Hannah's secret lover, who, having followed the trial in the news and fearing he would be implicated, had finally decided to cooperate fully with the prosecution. He had provided them with the complete call and text logs from Hannah's burner phone, the one she used exclusively for their affair. Ramos projected the call log from the burner phone onto the courtroom screens. It showed a single, damning entry, an outgoing call to Sarah Miller's number that night, but it had lasted only 3 minutes, ending promptly at 10:03 p.m. What followed was a series of text messages between Hannah and her lover, starting at 10:05 p.m. and continuing for the rest of the hour. On the screen, in black and white for the entire jury to see, was a text from Hannah sent at 10:47 p.m., the exact time the attack was believed to have taken place. The message was chilling. "It's almost time. I'll call you when it's done. I love you." The courtroom was stunned into absolute silence. Sarah Miller stared at the screen, her face ashen as the reality of her friend's manipulation washed over her. She had been used, a pawn in Hannah's game, her trust exploited to create a fake alibi for an attempted murder. Stephen Carlson, his face grim, slumped at the defense table, his surprise witness and entire strategy destroyed in a single dramatic moment. The lie had not just been exposed, it had been annihilated in real time with a piece of surprise evidence that no one, least of all the defendant, had seen coming. Hannah Brewer's reaction was no longer one of confident hope, but of pure, unrestrained fury. She glared at the image on the screen, then at her friend on the witness stand, her eyes burning with a hatred that was terrifying to behold. The mask was gone, not just cracked, but completely obliterated, revealing the raging, manipulative monster beneath. The jury watched her, their expressions a mixture of horror and cold realization. They had just witnessed the defense's case being dismantled by the defendant's own words, a digital bombshell that had detonated in the middle of the trial, leaving nothing but the ugly truth in its wake. With the defense's case in ruins and Hannah Brewer's guilt all but certain, the trial moved into its final, most emotionally charged phase, the victim impact statements. Though Matthew had survived, the crime had irrevocably shattered his family, and the court permitted his loved ones to speak about the profound and devastating impact of Hannah's actions. It was a chance for the human cost of the crime to be heard, a counterpoint to the clinical presentation of evidence and legal arguments that had dominated the proceedings. The focus shifted from the perpetrator to the lives she had so carelessly destroyed. Friends and colleagues of Matthew spoke of the vibrant, kind man they knew and how his light had been dimmed by the trauma he had endured. They described the long, agonizing weeks he spent in a coma, the painful process of his physical recovery, and the deep, invisible scars of betrayal that would likely never fully heal. Their words painted a heartbreaking picture of a life interrupted, a future stolen, and a trust so completely violated that it had changed the very core of the man they loved. The jury listened intently, their faces etched with sympathy and a quiet, building anger towards the woman at the defense table. The breaking point, the moment that silenced the entire courtroom and brought tears to the eyes of even the most hardened observers, came when Matthew's mother, Eleanor Foster, took the stand. She was a woman of immense grace and dignity, her face a portrait of a parent's worst nightmare. She spoke not of her own pain, but of the pain inflicted upon her 7-year-old grandson, Leo, who had been asleep upstairs while his mother tried to murder his father downstairs. She described the confusion and terror in her grandson's eyes, a child who had lost both parents in a single night, one to a brutal act of violence and the other to an evil he was too young to comprehend. Then, in a gesture of profound love and defiance, Eleanor turned away from the judge and the jury and looked directly at her grandson, who was sitting in the front row of the gallery between his aunt and uncle. Her voice, thick with emotion but unwavering in its resolve, filled the silent courtroom. "Leo," she said, her words a sacred vow, "I know you're scared, and I know you miss your daddy, but I promise you, my sweet boy, I promise you that the monster who hurt him will not hurt anyone ever again. We will be safe, and justice will be done." It was a grandmother's promise to her grandson, a declaration of war against the evil that had invaded their lives. Hannah Brewer, who had sat through the previous statements with a look of bored indifference, reacted to Eleanor's words with a stunning act of contempt. As the heartbroken grandmother spoke directly to her traumatized child, a small, cruel smile flickered across Hannah's lips, and she let out a short, sharp sigh of theatrical exasperation. It was a minute gesture, but in the emotionally charged atmosphere of the courtroom, it was as loud as a gunshot. It was a clear, unambiguous signal of her utter lack of remorse, her disdain for the family she had destroyed, and her profound sociopathic inability to feel anything for the child she had betrayed. The jury saw it. The judge saw it. Every person in the courtroom saw that flicker of amusement on her face, that dismissive sigh. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated evil, a glimpse into a soul so barren of empathy that the sight of a grandmother comforting a terrified child was nothing more than an annoyance. Any last shred of doubt, any lingering ember of sympathy for the woman in the pale blue sweater was extinguished in that single, horrifying moment. Her mask had not just slipped, she had ripped it off herself and stomped on it. Eleanor Foster finished her statement, her promise hanging in the air, a testament to the enduring power of love in the face of unspeakable darkness. As she stepped down from the witness stand, she did not look at Hannah. Her focus was solely on her grandson, the innocent victim caught in the wreckage of his mother's monstrous selfishness. The breaking point had been reached, not through a dramatic confession or a piece of physical evidence, but through a grandmother's promise and a sociopath's smile, a devastating combination that sealed Hannah Brewer's fate more surely than any legal argument ever could. The prosecution rested its case. There was nothing more to say. The evidence of the crime was overwhelming, but the evidence of the defendant's character, revealed in that one fleeting, contemptuous expression, was what truly condemned her. It showed the jury not just what she had done, but who she was, a monster hiding in plain sight, a woman for whom the concepts of love, family, and remorse were utterly foreign. Justice for Matthew and Leo Brewer was now in the hands of the jury, and there was little doubt as to what they would do. Just when it seemed the trial could hold no more surprises, Victoria Ramos stood and informed the judge that the state wished to call one final, unannounced rebuttal witness. A wave of confusion and anticipation swept through the courtroom. The prosecution's case was already overwhelmingly strong, and the purpose of this last-minute addition was a mystery to everyone, including a visibly perplexed defense team. The judge granted the request, and the clerk called the name that would deliver the trial's ultimate, shocking twist. The state calls Matthew Brewer to the stand. The courtroom doors opened, and a collective, audible gasp filled the room. Walking slowly but steadily towards the witness stand was Matthew Brewer himself, his face scarred but his eyes clear and resolute. His survival had been a closely guarded secret known only to the prosecutors, the doctors, and his immediate family, a strategic decision made to prevent Hannah from tailoring her defense around his existence. For weeks, she and her legal team had been operating under the firm belief that they were fighting a circumstantial murder case, not one with a living, breathing victim who could speak the truth. Hannah Brewer's reaction was a spectacle of pure, unadulterated shock. Her jaw fell open, her eyes widened in disbelief, and all the color drained from her face, leaving her with a ghastly, pale complexion. This was the one variable she had never accounted for, the one loose end she was certain she had tied. The man she had left for dead, the central ghost of the entire trial, was now walking towards her, a living testament to her failure and her evil. Her arrogant composure, her carefully crafted lies, her entire world dissolved into a puddle of primal fear in the face of the man who had survived her. Matthew took the stand, his gaze never once wavering from the woman who had been his wife. When the prosecutor asked him to identify his attacker, he raised a slightly trembling hand and pointed directly at Hannah. "She did this to me," he said. his voice raspy but strong, a voice the courtroom had only heard previously on a Happy Home video. "My wife, Hannah Brewer, tried to kill me." The words hung in the air, an irrefutable accusation from the one person whose testimony could erase all doubt, all legal maneuvering, and all defense strategies. With quiet, heartbreaking dignity, Matthew recounted the events of their anniversary night. He described the surprise dinner, the locket, and the last happy moments he had shared with the woman he loved. Then, his voice hardening, he detailed the brutal, unprovoked attack from behind, the searing pain, and the chillingly calm and determined look in Hannah's eyes as she stood over him, ensuring he was no longer moving before she left him to die. He spoke of waking up in the hospital weeks later to a world that had been completely destroyed, his wife arrested for his murder and his son in the care of his grandparents. It was the testimony of a man who had walked through hell and come back to tell the tale. But the final revelation, the ultimate twist in a trial full of them, came when Ramos asked Matthew about a discovery made by his family while they were cleaning out the couple's home. He explained that they had found a hidden compartment in Hannah's closet containing not just her secret credit cards and the burner phone, but a complete set of expertly forged identity documents. A driver's license, a social security card, and a passport, all bearing Hannah's picture but with a completely different name: Amelia Finch. There were also bank statements for an account under that name in a different state, an account she had been slowly funding with the money she stole from him. The truth was finally revealed in all its monstrous scope. Hannah's plan was never just to leave Matthew for her lover. It was to completely vanish. She was going to collect the $500,000 life insurance payout, abandon her lover, abandon her son, and disappear to start a new life as Amelia Finch, a wealthy, unencumbered woman with no ties to the past. The murder of her husband was simply the seed money for her complete reinvention, and her own child was just another piece of baggage she intended to leave behind. It was a level of selfish, narcissistic cruelty that was almost impossible to fathom. The jury stared at Hannah, their faces masks of pure revulsion. She was not just a would-be murderer and a thief, she was a woman who was willing to erase her own child from her life as casually as she would change her name. The final revelation had exposed the true depth of her depravity, a bottomless pit of self-interest that had no limits. She had not only tried to kill her husband, but she had planned to effectively kill herself, murdering the identity of Hannah Brewer, mother and wife, to give birth to a phantom. As Matthew Brewer concluded his testimony, a profound and heavy silence settled over the courtroom. There were no more questions to be asked, no more evidence to be presented. The living victim had spoken, and in doing so he had not only identified his attacker, but had also laid bare the full, horrifying extent of her monstrous plan. Justice was no longer a matter of legal debate. It was a moral certainty. The final nail had been hammered into Hannah Brewer's coffin, delivered by the very man she had tried to put in one. The jury's deliberation was a mere formality, a brief interlude before the inevitable conclusion. They returned in less than an hour, their faces grim and resolute, their verdict delivered with a clarity that echoed the sentiments of everyone who had witnessed the trial. Guilty on all counts: attempted murder, aggravated assault, and multiple counts of fraud. Hannah Brewer, who had once been so certain of her own cleverness, sat stone-faced as the verdict was read, her expression not one of remorse or fear, but of cold, hard fury at being outmaneuvered. Weeks later, at the sentencing hearing, the final act of the legal drama played out. Matthew's family provided their final impact statements, speaking not of anger, but of the long road to healing that lay ahead for both Matthew and his son, Leo. Matthew himself submitted a written statement, read aloud by Victoria Ramos, in which he spoke of the ghost of the woman he had once loved and his hope that she would be prevented from ever harming another person again. It was a statement of quiet strength and profound loss, a final, dignified farewell to the 14 years of his life that had been built on a lie. When the judge offered Hannah the opportunity to speak, she stood, her posture erect and defiant. Her lawyer, Stephen Carlson, subtly shook his head, pleading with his eyes for her to remain silent, but Hannah's arrogance would not be contained. She did not apologize or ask for mercy. Instead, she delivered a chilling, self-pitying speech in which she painted herself as the true victim, a woman misunderstood and persecuted by a vindictive system and a thankless husband. She showed not a single shred of remorse for her actions, her words a final, desperate performance for an audience that no longer believed her. The judge, a man with a reputation for his stoic and impartial demeanor, listened to Hannah's diatribe with a barely concealed disgust. When she was finished, he did not launch into a tirade or a lecture. Instead, he looked directly at her, his voice low and steady, and delivered a sentence that was both a legal judgment and a moral condemnation. He spoke of the profound evil of her actions, her calculated cruelty, and the terrifying void where her conscience should have been. He sentenced her to the maximum possible term, life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 40 years, ensuring that she would be an old woman before she could ever taste freedom again. As the heavy sentence was handed down, the courtroom remained silent, a collective breath of relief seeming to pass through the gallery. The long, agonizing ordeal was finally over. Justice, hard-won and desperately needed, had been served. But as the bailiffs moved to escort her from the courtroom for the last time, Hannah Brewer had one final act of defiance, one last message of contempt for the family she had tried to destroy. She turned her head, her eyes locking first with Matthew, then with his mother, Eleanor. The mask of the victim, the teacher, the wife, was gone forever, and what was left was pure, unadulterated evil. A slow, terrifying smirk spread across her lips, a silent, chilling expression of triumph and unrepentant hatred. It was a look that said she regretted nothing, that she felt no remorse, and that even in her defeat, she still believed she had won. The smirk was her final, defiant act, a horrifying glimpse into the black hole of her soul, a last, poisonous gift to the family she had failed to break. Then she turned and was led away, her smirk disappearing behind the courtroom doors, leaving behind a legacy of pain and a chilling memory that would haunt them forever.